Hello and welcome to the preview of the March issue. I'm Joy Macknight, Managing Editor at The Banker, and I'm joined by Editor Brian Caplen to talk about 50 years of The Banker's Top 1000 World Bank rankings. Brian, thanks so much for joining me today.
You're welcome.
We're coming up to the 50th anniversary of The Banker's Top 1000 World Bank rankings. Obviously, a lot has changed in 50 years. Who were on top of the ranking in 1970 when the ranking was launched?
The cover story in the March issue is a look back through that 50 years, sort of in preparation to what we'll have later in the year, July, when the latest ranking, the actual 50th anniversary ranking, comes out. And it's very interesting. I've spent a whole lot of time looking through, the past volumes of The Banker. And if you go back to 1970 when it started, you find that it was very much a ranking dominated by American banks. We ranked it on assets at that time, not Tier 1 capital. You had 7 American banks in the ranking, a lot of whose names now have disappeared, some that haven't. So Bank of America was top. Bank of America obviously still very much with us today. We had a bank called First National City in second place, which became Citibank. But then you've got banks like Manufacturers Hanover in fifth, Chemical Bank, which joined together. They then joined with Chase, and that became JP Morgan Chase. So you've got a lot of sort of consolidation that's gone on since that time. And when you look back through the decades, you see that a lot. So the European banks were big in 1980, Japanese banks in 1990, when we moved it to 1,000 and put it on Tier 1 capital. And following that, you've had a big period of sort of consolidation when, the kind of excesses from a big growth period are worked off and the banks start to streamline themselves.
We also have the ranking from 2019. So, what was the top banks in the top 10 of that ranking?
For some time now, and particularly in 2019, it's been dominated by the big Chinese banks. So the top 4 in the 2019 ranking are ICBC, China Construction Bank, Agricultural Bank of China, and Bank of China, followed by the big American banks, and then HSBC and Mitsubishi. So the big interesting question is, if we've seen those other countries with their banks move up the table and move down, what will happen to the Chinese? And I think this is quite an interesting time for China because we know that the Chinese banking system faces challenges. It has some bad assets that have come from the reflation that took place after the crisis. We've had a property bubble. You've got shadow banking. And you've got a bigger tech threat in China as anywhere, with people like Alipay and Tencent and so forth on the scene. At the moment, it's a very tough time in China because you've got the outbreak of the coronavirus as the economy was slowing anyway. And I think that is going to lead on at some point to some changes in the Chinese banking structure. And now, it doesn't mean names are going to disappear, but it may be that some of the smaller banks are absorbed or consolidated, or some of the bigger banks, decide perhaps they need to specialise a bit more in one area rather than doing everything. I think we're going to see some exciting changes from China over the next 5 years.
Okay. What about profitability? Obviously, there was a big spike in profitability before the financial crisis, but what has happened since?
Going back to 2008, return on capital was 20%, and for some banks it was even higher prior to the crisis. They were obviously making loads of money. And the regulator really should have been thinking about, well, if this industry is making sort of abnormal profits, shouldn't we be worrying about it? Then we had a sort of big fall off in profits as the crisis hit, and now we've seen a recovery to an average of about 13% return on capital, which is fine for the banks that are getting that, or they're getting more than that. But in some parts of the world, like in Europe, your returns on capital are still in the single digits. And that's not enough to actually cover the cost of capital against an environment where banks are finding it difficult to make profits, interest rates are low, they're facing huge costs from overhauling their IT systems and compliance costs. So it's a tough time for banks, particularly in Europe.
Going on to sort of regional and where sort of some of the profits are coming from, you've also seen a big shift in terms of where those profits are being generated. Can you elaborate on that?
The big areas of the world, Asia, Europe, and North America, and their shares of the total 1,000 profits prior to the crisis in 2006 and where they are now in 2019 or 2019, 2020. And basically, Asia and Europe are more or less swapped places because Asia used to get about 20% of profits, Europe got 43%. But now it's the other way around. Asia gets 42% of the profits and Europe only gets 21%. So we've seen a massive flow of profits there from west to east. North America, on the other hand, stands where it was at 27%. And I think that's due to the fact that in the States, they were much more effective at sorting out the banks when they got into trouble than we were in Europe. They basically said, look, get these bad loans off your books, recapitalise and move on. Whereas in Europe, there's been a sort of slow burn approach, just kind of let it work off slowly, don't do anything too drastic. And I think that's been very negative for European banks.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for your insights, Brian. You can read Brian's analysis in the March issue of The Banker on thebanker.com.